evening, everyone, and that was a very generous introduction. I have been introduced in different ways over the last, many years. Whenever I have spoken, particularly on Zoom, thanks to COVID and so on. But rarely has my introduction included a reference to the fact that I danced with a glass on my head. So I can only attribute that to a considerable amount of affection from Arun Roy. But thank you. I mean, clearly, this is a very eclectic group, and all of you are highly qualified in your own way, in your respective domains and disciplines. So I think, first of all, I'm very glad to make your acquaintance through this session of today. And I'd like to compliment Mr. Arun Roy for this initiative. I'd heard of it. He discussed it with me last year. But for a variety of reasons, I was not able to join. So I'm glad to be here. And thank you, Arun, for giving me this chance. You'll have to bear with me. I'm in Delhi, and pollution, AQI, and this particular pattern of the weather has left me a little sort of hobbled by way of a very sore throat. So if I take a minute or so off, please allow me. I'll put myself on mute. Sorry. I hope this doesn't happen too often. But my brief today, and I understand that our timeline is up to 2030, that is 8:30 p.m., right? So if that is correct, Ashutosh, I will speak for about half an hour, 40 minutes, maybe a little before 8 o'clock, and then hand over to you so that we can have a more interactive kind of session. I think that would be more rewarding for all of us. So very briefly, when we say challenges to Indian security, this is really a kind of a conceptual issue, first of all, about what is security and how do we relate it to India, which in turn means what is India? India is a nation state, and it has a certain civilizational pedigree. It also went through a fairly turbulent history from the medieval period onwards by way of foreign elements entering India. And the most recent, of course, is what we describe as the colonial phase and independence in 1947 and the Republic being formed in 1950, and the fact that next year, 2025, we would be celebrating 75 years of the Indian Republic. So these are the two kind of, benchmarks. Sorry. One is the concept of security. The second is, how does it relate to the entity of the state? So I would like to leave the following kind of formulation or thought for you to consider. That when we talk about security as a concept, any concept is a function of interpretation. Interpretation, which means it takes us to language. Language has its own roots, which are, in a way, I think, grounded in what we call as in the jargon that I am more familiar with, we talk about the strategic culture of different large states and societies. And India is a very distinctive example of a history that, depending on where you start, we go back by a few thousand years. And there's a fairly rich body of thought about the evolution of both language, concept, and the way in which it has been applied in a modern sense, particularly in the limited template of political science, because we talk about the state. Now, when you talk about the concept of security, it's very interesting. For purposes of our discussion today, I think I'll look at the Indian experience in three broad phases, which is the equivalent of the colonial experience. And here, I think I would draw attention to Jallianwala Bagh as one of the punctuations from the Indian perspective of the freedom struggle and from the colonial perspective of imposing law and order, and maintaining the security of the empire. That's one broad temporal chunk. The second is post 1947 up to 1991, which is coterminous with the end of the Cold War. And this is what you might broadly call as the Cold War decades. And the third, in the interest of time, I won't disaggregate it further, but we can look at the post-Cold War. If there was more time, I would have perhaps suggested that we can look at this as 91 to 2001 as one period. And the post 9/11 global order, disorder, whichever way you want to describe it, as the equivalent of 3B. So the concept of security can be interpreted, or it has been interpreted, depending on these 3 or 4 timelines that I'm talking about. Now here there's a very, to me, interesting and rewarding kind of correlation, which is that when we talk about interpreting a word, number one, it has a deep link to the original language. So in English, for want of given its own limitations of philology and number of words and number of alphabets, the 8-letter word security has been differently interpreted. But it's also closely linked to the power grid, as we call it. Meaning that if you look at how security was interpreted, there is a strong correlation with the elements or the forces in power. So therefore, why I illustrated or drew attention to Jallianwala Bagh is to say that when that particular incident took place, sorry, and when that incident took place, the British Empire justified it, saying that those of you who remember the trial when it was held both in India and in London at that time, justified the action of the British general and General Dyer and so on, saying that he had done the right thing in ensuring the security of the empire. And if a certain number of natives had to be bayoneted, killed, trampled, so be it. So the way in which security is interpreted, this is my short point, is linked to the power grid of that particular temporal phase. Fast forward now to the Cold War. The Cold War was largely sort of determined or shaped by the tension or the competition between the two former superpowers, the United States on one side, leading the West, and the former Soviet Union, which was part of what we now call the Warsaw Pact. Both sides had invested in nuclear weapons because that was driven by technology. Because when we talk about the period 1947, I should actually correct it and say 1945 to 1991, because in a larger global sense, technology mediates security. And Hiroshima Nagasaki introduced the atomic age. So 1945 to 1991 is both the Cold War and the atomic age. And it's very interesting, the way in which security is interpreted at that time, again has a correlation to the power grid, which is the superpowers. And both of them in their own way pursued the acquisition of lethal nuclear weapons and missiles. And if you recall, the most lethal weapon and the most credible at that time was what is called as the SLBM, the submarine launched ballistic missile, wherein you could have a long range missile in a submarine. It could be fired from underwater, carrying a nuclear warhead, and it could traverse a range of between 7,000 to 7,500 kilometers. If you can imagine that distance, and hit the target with an accuracy of between 100 to 200 meters, which is what is called as the CET. This is that particular period. So there was an estimate. It was done by Robert McNamara, who was a US Defense Secretary at one time, and also a great number cruncher. Those of you who are familiar with the US and its history would recall McNamara, Vietnam, etc., etc. He had carried out a study and said that the United States had enough nuclear capability to hit the former Soviet Union 28 times. And at the end of the day, there was some staggering number of casualties that would have been inflicted on the former Soviet Union, knowing fully well that the former Soviet Union would respond with its own second strike capability, and that the United States would also lose a large part of its population, but it would be of a much lower order than what the Soviets would have lost, largely because of the geography and expanse of the United States, etc., etc. So this is quite, as I said, serious stuff that was going on in the Cold War decades up to the mid 80s, Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev. And interestingly, in a conceptual, theoretical way, the two superpowers were convincing the world that actually we are very secure and we are stable because we have finally agreed on mutually assured destruction. So if you can imagine this as a equation, security becomes equal to mutually assured destruction. And the acronym for mutually assured destruction is MAD. So there is something very Freudian that for many decades the world accepted this interpretation that the former superpowers and their allies are ostensibly secure because they can destroy each other in this manner, and they have created tripwires by which they will not reach that level, and therefore MAD, etc., etc. My only point as an interest as an analyst is, when I was doing some work on this, is about how concepts are interpreted and they're also blinkered. So the complete irrationality of saying that you can make a state secure by agreeing to lose millions of your people to not just a nuclear strike, but the after effects of a nuclear strike, which is radiation and all kinds. Hiroshima, Nagasaki is dwarfed when you think of the lethality of the current generation of nuclear weapons. So this was one phase or one period when security was interpreted in this way and pursued in that manner. And of course, we know that with the end of the Cold War, there was a complete review and reappraisal, and there was, for the first time, an understanding after the end of the Cold War that security could no longer be considered in an exclusive military way with an overwhelming reliance on nuclear weapons. It had to be more inclusive. That from exclusive, it had to be more inclusive. Everyone cited the example of the Soviet Union and said it had gone into overstretch and it was not able to sustain its own. 1 second, just give. Sorry, today is not my best day. My nose is completely blocked. So anyway, going back to the conceptual argument that after the end of the Cold War, there was a recognition, I think, by and large, amongst the professionals that security could not be interpreted in this exclusive manner and that it had to be more inclusive. And post-Cold War, there was a focus on inclusive security, and my early work at that time, I'll try and compress that. If you can look at this, I don't know if you can see it. Can you see this hexagon? Ashutosh, dikh raha hai?
Can you hear me now, sir?
You
need to lift. Yeah, you need to lift it a little more, sir. Now, yes, we can see it now.
Okay.
Yeah.
If you can just see it, keep it in your mind. And if you can make out those three arms, there's political, military, and economy. And then there is technology, environment, and human security. Yes, aapko dikh raha hai na? Broadly?
Yes,
okay.
I think.
So this was my own at that time interpretation, saying that we now have to have a new model. And I had advanced this in a very tentative way, saying that we need to look at security as a composite of 6 elements, with the primary attributes or primary strands being the political security, the economic, and the military security for a state. And that in the modern age, it has to be complemented by a concern about environmental issues, which is climate change, resource dependency, countries that don't have hydrocarbons, etc., etc. And that technology is becoming a very important driver. So in the jargon, we talk about techno-strategic imbrication. That security is now being influenced by the techno-strategic element, the kind of synthesis, how technology shapes strategy and strategy shapes technology. A good example is the nuclear weapon. As we go further into the session, I'm sure some of you, particularly those in the IT sector, etc., would know that AI, is going to be a particularly new disruptive kind of technology when it comes to how it will impact security, etc. But we'll get there later. And finally, all of this has to impact the human element. the edge part. So to me, this was the most important element that it had been ignored in the Cold War and earlier, even in the colonial period, that in the colonial period, the security of the ruler, at that time the colonial ruler, was considered paramount. And therefore, the whole Gandhian experience about the colored man. The same thing you can see in the United States, where the colored man had a different kind of security. And those who were in the power grid or the power loop had interpreted security in a way that advanced their own interest. So, there is again a correlation between power and discourse. I don't want to hijack this discussion, but, there is a chapter and verse about the correlation between these elements, power, discourse, and there are a number of critical theory, people who have written extensively on this. I'm sure all of you know about it. Now, when we come into the modern period, which is the post-Cold War, I think governments and the world at large accepted, at least conceptually, notionally, that human security had to be given adequate priority. Therefore, at the global level, you see the beginning of what we call now as the human development indicators. For instance, even the United Nations came out with its own recommendation, and HDI became a kind of buzzword. This was conceptual, this was something that was aspired for, but as I said, the actual reality was perhaps not as flattering, because from 1991 or even 1993 to 2023, which is 30 years, if you see the trajectory of human security, by and large, I think in most countries in the world, barring some honorable exceptions, you have seen a situation where the rich have got richer and the poor have got poorer. And the so-called gap between the haves and the have-nots, both at the state level and within states, is increasing. And there are a number of reasons for this: the way in which capitalism is interpreted, the way in which economic models, etc., etc. So that is the larger conceptual point. Now, my reel back to India and why I spoke about language and what I found very rewarding in my own early work was that different countries have, in a way, introduced or interpreted the concept of security based on their own culture, based on their own language, based on their own experience. This correlation between geography and history, how geography and history shape each other, as you go through the long cycle of history. And my sort of focus at that time was, how did India understand security? And I think this is a fairly obvious point to make, that all roads lead to the Arthashastra. So in the Arthashastra, those of you who are familiar, you'll remember that Chanakya, amongst various things that he spoke about, there was the concept of Yogakshema, meaning that while acknowledging that the emperor at that time, the Chakravartin, had certain duties and obligations, the most onerous being the safety and security of the empire. In those days, the empire had frontiers, not borders, but they had to be secure. So the first attribute was to ensure that the empire was secure. And furthermore, that the inhabitants of the empire were also secure, which is why he introduced the concept of Yogakshema, which loosely translates in English as well-being, the well-being of the citizen. And within this, there is further disaggregation saying that the duty, the dayatva of the Chakravarti and his team is to ensure that the most vulnerable elements in the empire are given top billing in terms of their security. And here the reference is to women, children, the aged, the infirm, etc., etc. And only when their security is assured would the Chakravarti and his team be fulfilling their obligations and duties in the appropriate way. And you can see again a correlation from there to Gandhian thought, where Gandhi says much the same thing, that the last year has to be wiped in terms of the human condition. So I personally have advanced this argument that when we talk about the Indian state as we said in the sort of rudimentary understanding of political science, state is defined or identified by certain characteristics. The primary one, of course, is size, a certain geographical area, and borders. In the borders day and age, from empire we have now moved to borders, nation states with borders, and that this should be accepted by the peer group at the global level, at the regional level, and that there should be a kind of status quo about the inviolability of borders. And subsequently, the responsibility of those who are governing. We have now moved away from rulers, particularly in the Indian context. We elect our leaders and they are supposed to govern us. They are not our rulers. We have to say this repeatedly. But of course, this is a distinction that is very quickly glossed over in India in 2024. But the obligation, the dayatva of governance is to ensure the security of the state, both in terms of the physical attributes of the state, as also its human dimension, the well-being of the citizen. And to my mind, in a nutshell, India's security challenges are subsumed in these two, I would say, baskets. One, your sovereignty. Two, your ability to ensure the appropriate level of human security for a vast demography, which is between 1.3 to 1.4 billion citizens who are aspiring. And I think India is now dealing with its own internal, what I would call as the revolution of rising aspirations, which has also been enabled by technology. I think in today's cyber world, the cell phone, etc., there's a very interesting development where we have leapfrog literacy. Now you don't have to read and write. You just need to be able to use a cell phone and get some audio and understand how to use OTPs and follow instructions. And that has in turn, I think, created a revolution in terms of both aspiration and when the aspiration is not realized, despondency, which has its own security dimension. Can I stop here for a minute? I'm sorry. I'm just taking a 1 minute break. I just need to sort of where I was, sorry for this interruption. But we are not saying that the Indian security challenge can be, in a way, I feel, addressed in these two baskets. One is the sovereignty of the state and its borders and the kind of turbulence we are dealing with. And the second, as I said, is the challenge of governance in terms of the HDI or the Human Development Indicators. And for this, I want to introduce another kind of slide and say that when we look at India in the larger global strategic framework, I don't know if you can see this. If you can, zara bata dena. Dikh raha hai aapko? Can you see it?
We can see it.
थोड़ा सा आपने please shift it slightly towards your left. Towards your left. Yeah, perfect.
So basically, you will see this is the second hexagon. You have the United States on one side, and you have the European Union, and you have the other members of the hexagon, which is China and Russia, India and Japan. So my own formulation is that the next few decades, barring a black swan event, will be largely determined by the interplay of the relationship between the 6 sides of the second hexagon. And those of you who are mathematical wizards can do permutation combination about the interplay between the 2 hexagons. So there is H1 with 6 elements and there is H2 with 6 elements. And you could do, as I said, the permutation combination and how some of them are actually multi-domain. For instance, when we talk about the environment and the economy and the correlation there, etc., etc. So for India now, the challenge is, first of all, to acknowledge what is the nature of Indian security. In a recent article, I used the word powerless, meaning that it is quite fragile. And notwithstanding the claims that are constantly made about other attributes of India, 5th largest global economy will become the 3rd largest economy, which is now the current mantra. If you look at the larger global picture, particularly over the last couple of years, which is after the war in Ukraine, and now more recently the war in Gaza, and now we have seen what the Houthis have done as far as global shipping is concerned. These are all examples of the kind of turbulence that is now, in a way, going to be the characteristic of the next few years. And to use a term from thermodynamics, there is a steady increase in the entropy, the kind of disorder that we are seeing. And the ability of the state to be the primary actor is also bit of a question mark. Now, those of you who are familiar with theory know that there is a formulation of Max Weber who had once postulated that one of the attributes of state is that it is the only entity that has a monopoly on the legitimate use of macro force. Now, after 9/11, all of that has been stood on its head. And we are aware that the non-state entity, very often, with state support, is able to challenge the primacy and the efficacy of the state in matters pertaining to the use of macro force. And the most recent example we have in front of us is the Houthis, who were a totally nondescript group which had only a footprint in Yemen, and now demonstrated an ability, very innovative, very audacious, to disrupt global shipping. So my formulation is that when we look at India today, the two challenges that come to mind are, well, maybe in a way you can disaggregate this also and say that India's security can also be addressed at three levels. And all of them, to my mind, are interlinked. It's not as if there are three verticals and you can address one on one day and the second on the other day and so on. The first is the strategic dimension. These 6 or 7 players that we spoke about. That there is a constant kind of interplay where the trans-border military capability which these countries possess, these 6 members possess, will be at play. So whether you talk about nuclear weapons, you talk about missiles, you talk about satellites, or as I said, the trans-border military capability, the ability to deliver ordnance over 5,000 kilometers, the ability to carry a brigade level, which is maybe 1,000 people from point A to point B and mount a military challenge. These are all elements of that strategic contestation. And India would have to be equipped to deal with that particular challenge in a credible way. The second is India would also have to deal with what is called as the conventional security, for which the Indian military is the principal organ. And here we are talking about issues like sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the way in which the Indian military plays its own role, particularly in terms of the democratic experience. Again, without belaboring the point, a professional military, an apolitical military, which is committed to the Constitution, is very important for a democracy. We saw this in the case of the United States when President Trump was there. Sorry. We saw this in the case of the United States when President Trump was there, and you know what happened when the chiefs of staff were asked to act in a certain manner. And if you remember, one of the generals had actually apologized for whatever he had said and done at that time when he walked with the president, when there was the equivalent of a political protest that was ostensibly against the principles and values of the Constitution. So military has a number of what I would call as roles that it does by pure osmosis, even if it doesn't do or say anything. And the Indian military, I think, has a very credible record, both in terms of defense of the national sovereignty issues. We saw 1962, we saw the first war for Kashmir, 47, 48, and most recently we saw Kargil and Galwan again, where we were pushed, onto the back foot, but yet the Indian military did what it could. So this is one challenge, and I think the irony for India is that 75 years after we have become a republic, which will be 2025, 75 years definitely after we have become independent, this is now the 77th year, in August of 2024, our borders are still not stable. Meaning, with both China and Pakistan, they are following a revisionist agenda. And India does not have as yet an adequate response. And that is not a very positive augury for a state like India. Maybe in the QA we can discuss as to what are the challenges. But China, its own strategic culture, its ambitious agenda about expansionism. We've seen China, Taiwan, and now we are seeing how China is conducting itself in the South China Sea with the ASEAN countries, some of them, and with India. So this is going to be a complex challenge. And we are doubly sort of fettered because we have a trade imbalance. China is one of our largest trading partners, and the trade balance is in their favor. And we are dependent on that. So how do we deal with that? And concurrently, China, Pakistan have a deep strategic cooperation. And Pakistan has its own agenda, which it has been pursuing since 1947-48. And I think even as we speak, and tomorrow's Ram Mandir and what that represents for India and how that is going to play out in the subcontinent are all, I think, a kind of issues that we'll have to see how they unspool in the year ahead or the next few years ahead. But they would definitely have an impact, I think, on the challenges for Indian security. Now that we know the two broad, I would say, areas where India has to address, I'm not talking about Manipur, I'm not talking about what is happening internally, because large countries have internal security issues. And personally, I'm very, I would say, concerned about. So, the Manipur issue, as I said, we could perhaps take up later when we talk about the internal security challenge. And the reason I'm concerned is because of the geography of the Northeast, the proximity, and the foreign so-called element, whether it's Myanmar, China, etc., etc. But now that we have broadly identified the nature of the Indian security challenge, which is at one level territorial integrity, the second is the way in which India has to deal with the socio-economic development of its vast numbers, and also maintain a certain degree of fraternity. I mean, what is Manipur? Manipur is a complete breakdown of fraternity. And left unchecked, and again, I draw attention to what is happening on the fervor of the Mandir, that if this takes a certain direction, I think the internal fabric of India could get further damaged. And that would have serious security consequences. One of my analogies that I often use when we talk about India and the internal security challenge, which is linked to human security and which in turn, I think, would have a bearing on India's profile in the larger global template, is that just as we talk about the ozone layer for climate change and say that the ozone layer is very delicate and it performs a very vital function. And if that ozone layer is rent for whatever reason, then the consequences, I think, have only been modeled. We haven't seen them in real life, but they would be quite negative and consequential. I fear sometimes that the internal fabric of India, which has its own genealogy, it has its own, I would say, trajectory. And it is not as if it has been imposed by the government of the day. It is something that has, I think, evolved over the long cycle of history. If that is rent in an irreparable way, then I think the internal security challenge for India could become far more complex. And I think institutional competence and integrity would be put to test, particularly for, I think, the Indian government at the highest political levels, which is, we talk about the CCPA, the Cabinet Committee, CCS, the Cabinet Committee on Security and Political Affairs, the CCPA, and the institutions, whether it is the Indian military, the Indian paramilitary forces, the Indian police at the state level, the Indian judiciary, etc., etc. All of them have, I think, to perform their own roles. And my fear, again, I'm speaking personally, is I think they may be found inadequate. Now, this is a strong statement to make. Let me stick with the Indian military, an institution with which I'm a little more familiar. And I'll give you some numbers. I think that would sort of give you an idea and illuminate my own concern. Now, military capability is directly impacted or shaped by resources. I mean, that's the case for stating the obvious. Now, we know that if you look at the global spending ladder, the United States leads the list. Not for a moment am I suggesting that India has to be in the same league as either the US or, for that matter, China. They have deeper pockets and different challenges. India now, a last estimate, the budgeted estimate for defense for 2023-24 was 5,93,538 crores. Now that seems like a lot of money. But if you disaggregate this and read the subtext, and those of you who have an interest, I would urge you to look at the report of the PRS. The PRS is the Parliamentary Research Service. They have a legislative research department, and they put out some very valuable reports. I'll summarize some of them in a Twitter format, which is that in as much as this looks impressive, 5 lakhs, almost 6 lakh crore Indian rupees, which has its own correlation in billions of dollars. But this is where I think we have to interpret the reality. Two things are happening, that For the period 2021 to 26, the armed forces and the Ministry of Defense had made a projection that they wanted 17.46 lakh crores. 17.46. And what was given to them in that period, the 5-year period, was about 9 lakh crores. All this is there. If you want to see it, I can send you the link later. More importantly, if you look at the disaggregation of the defense budget, out of this 5,93,538 crores, a large amount is going towards salaries and pensions. I'm a pensioner. I benefit from the pension that is being given. So are my other colleagues here. And I'm sure there are other pensioners here who are receiving their pension from the government of India, whether at the center or the state level. But the negative impact on budgetary sort of determinants, and that in turn has an impact on the modernization and the preparedness of the armed forces, their combat capability, is that the capital outlay has shrunk, meaning that in the period 2013-14, before this government came to power, not power, but was governing, 32% of the budget, defense budget, was spent on capital. In the period 23-24, the last budget that I mentioned, the ministry is estimated to spend only 29%. So there is a drop of 3% in capital. Capital is what you use for modernization acquisition. And furthermore, most of our acquisitions are from abroad. We are very dependent on foreign suppliers, whether it is Russia, whether it's America, whether it's France, whether it's Israel, etc. If you look at a 20-year period from roughly 2003, 2004, where we are now in 2023, the dollar rupee has moved from 62 to 82, roughly. So that will give you an idea about the depression that is taking place and the shrinkage. And within this, we are not able to equip our armed forces with the right inventory. And one more stark reality. Many years ago in 2017-18, the Parliamentary Committee on Defense, headed by Major General Khanduri, a fine officer, sapper, who was also a minister, cabinet minister in Mr. Vajpayee's cabinet, was the chairman of that parliamentary committee. And he submitted what I thought was a very comprehensive and a very candid report about the inadequacies in the inventory. Now, the reason why I'm dismayed as an analyst is that instead of applying the correctives, Khanduri was removed from that post. And no worthwhile reports are coming out from the Parliamentary Committee on Defense. So much so that, as I said, now we do not have an adequate picture. Everything is projected as, Modi goes to France and comes back with a new deal on the Rafale, Rajnath Singh goes and, India has been acquiring aircraft for years. But when we acquired new aircraft, it became a national event. So this, I think, is misleading. We have a serious problem by way of inventory in the conventional sense. I mean, we are in this very, very ignominious position that India does not make its own personal weapon. I mean, we have sent people to the moon. We have a moon probe. We have a nuclear submarine. We have missiles. But we do not design our own personal weapon, which is the Kalashnikov equivalent. We have tried, but it has not succeeded. I mean, the two service people in this group, Colonel Khan and Group Captain Kumar, will perhaps add to this. And this is what I mean by it's very uneven. And the only way is if the entire, I would say, ecosystem for defense inventory, defense equipment, defense production is given appropriate encouragement. I mean, we had an absurd situation. Many of you are in the policy loop and you all know what the reality is. We had this great Bofors gun, which became a political which became a political scandal. And for years, the Indian government could not acquire a new artillery gun. We went to Kargil with the Bofors gun. Kargil was over in 1999. We spoke about making an Indian gun. And when I was speaking to some of the manufacturers, some of them are in the Pune, Bombay area, they hit a very odd roadblock that they could make the gun, for trials. But the rules of India did not allow a private player to test a gun in India. It only had to be done by a public sector unit. I mean, if ever there was Alice in Wonderland, I think it was this kind of what I would call as interpretation of how we protect turf and try to. So this is just one example of the mismatch. On one hand, resources, number two, competence, and also the what I would call as the ability to have a efficient higher defense management team. Now, I've long said this, I've written about this, and I've spoken saying that India needs direly, urgently, security reforms. In the same manner that we were able to embark upon economic reforms when Dr. Manmohan Singh was the finance minister and Mr. Narasimha Rao was the prime minister. We need something similar now with far greater urgency. But unfortunately, it's not happening. And this is without reference to the last bit of what I wanted to draw attention to, is new technologies. Now, technology is going to shape, both warfare and security preparedness and security inadequacies. AI is only one example, but very broadly in a Twitter manner, I could say that earlier we used to talk about the global commons only as the maritime domain, the oceans and seas of the world. Now the new global commons are maritime, cyber, space, spectrum. And how this will be managed, contested, commandeered, quarantined, we don't know yet. But not only do you have state entities, you now have corporate entities like Elon Musk. And they might come up with their own norms and regulations, and I don't know how states will deal with this. And India is again in a very precarious position that those of you who are into technology are aware of semiconductors. India stands nowhere. I draw your attention to some remarks made recently in Delhi by Professor Paul Raj. Those of you who know of him, Arogya Swami Paul Raj is an emeritus professor at Stanford and a man who is synonymous with some pioneering work in telecom. He spoke in India recently in Delhi at the India International Center and said that we have almost missed the bus on semiconductors. So we will become dependent again, just as we are now dependent on Russia, America, France, etc. for military inventory of the conventional type. We might end up being dependent on the powers that control the semiconductor industry and all its affiliates. Now, unless there is a cognizance of your security challenge, I think the ability to take adequate steps is going to be very limited. And my anguish is that I don't think there is any serious, we had a very dramatic kind of attempt again by introducing the CDS. Prime Minister Modi announced the CDS. We all applauded it. But it has been relatively, I would say, stillborn. And after the tragic demise of General Rawat, the fact that the government appointed a retired 3-star officer and made him 4-star, is not something that I think augurs well, because there is a clear sense of political, I would say, involvement in what should be purely professional matters. So these are some of the, I would say, challenges even structurally in terms of the rewiring. So let me stop here. I said I'll stop at 8 o'clock. We're just 1 minute past 8. I hope I've been able to give you a broad sense. I apologize for these interruptions because of my nasal condition. Later on, after the session is over, if anybody can give me tips about how to deal with a blocked nose, I'll be grateful. But on that note, let me stop and hand over to Group Captain Kumar. Ashutosh?
Thank you, sir. At least we have two doctors here who can probably give you some advice on your blocked nose. So anyway, now that you have concluded your talk, sir, is over to the audience. If anybody wants to ask any question, any comment, or any query that you would like to raise.
May I speak few things for Commodore Bhaskar? The talk was very educative and excellent one. We finally got an expert on these matters who can say things with so much boldness, I must say, in current times. Thank you, Commodore, for enlightening us with so many things. The state of affairs in defense production, the level of our research work in defense production and high technology is far from satisfactory. I have a feeling that it is going down gradually. The standards in our universities, what we had in 50s and early 60s, perhaps no longer there. This is one aspect. Second thing, in our young days, we used to find that India used to be a peacemaker, be it a Korean War or Congo, anywhere. We used to send peacekeeping force, and we were part of the effort. Nowadays, since last few years, we seem to be a party in every war. The Houthis attack our ships. Can't we avoid that? It is something peculiar happening. And lastly, our eastern border, China, Arunachal, Ladakh, and other places. I feel that China's expansionism is well known. It is just like a disease China is suffering from by genetically or something. But even Vietnam and Philippines, they will not allow China to grab even 1 inch of land. The Chinese expansionism works only with India, and not only now, since 1950. So these are the things I wanted to just put forward. If somebody or Commodore Uday Bhaskar could uh, educate us briefly. Thank you.
Should we take 2-3 questions, Ashutosh, so that others get a chance to also speak?
Sir, Doctor, yes, Dr. Jha also wanted to say something. So I would request Dr. Jha unmute.
No, I had just a comment to make on the presentation by Commodore Bhaskar. I personally uh, hold him in high regards and esteem about what he writes or speaks on for different fora about defense of it. It's a complex issue. I was really in a different realm to this evening, that such complex issues can be discussed in such a lucid way and easily understandable to men who are not from the forces, who are not in defense studies. Just I wanted to compliment him. And Ashok probably uh, spoke on my behalf, I would say. I had the same kind of questions going in my mind about what we are doing with our security preparation. For in an effort to play to the galleries, we make a deal for a file, we bring certain number of fighter planes, and then there's an event management that is welcome, the Nibu and ye wo mirchi वगैरह टांग के, we make a show of it, and then we don't realize that years have gone by and we have not been able to manufacture our own Rafale. It was granted to some private party, I believe, in the deal. That worries me as an ordinary citizen. And as we look around our borders, and there are no frontiers, and these are all borders, it appears to be very fragile. That was my that was what was going in my mind. So Das said the same thing. So we'd like to hear from Commodore Bhaskar.
Take one more question, Ashutosh. 3 ले लें क्या?
Sir, Dr. Sarita also wants to say something. So over to her.
Sure.
Ma'am, you kindly unmute yourself. Dr.
Yeah,
Sarita.
unmuted.
Yes.
So my question is why we are so against involving private companies. In US, there are so many involvement by the private company. Government and corporate world should work together. Should we so averse to that this is provided to a private company and not by being done by government? Or should we involve and make them like a partner?
Shall I respond to these 3 questions, Ashutosh?
Yes, sir.
Is that all, Dr. Sarita? Ki aur kuch hai?
No, that's it, sir.
Oh. Shall I respond, Ashutosh?
Yes, sir. Over to you.
So let me sort of take this maybe with Dr. Sarita's observation first and then address what Dr. Jha and Mr. Das have raised. Madam, I think as far as your experience with the United States and what you might call as the rise of the military-industrial complex, this is part of America's own strategic culture. There is a whole history between the 2 world wars, how America's MIC was evolved, nurtured, etc., and the correlation between the government and the private sector. And large sums of money have been invested and some phenomenal research has been done. So this is the American model. Now, for us in India, because we were a post-colonial state, we didn't have enough resources. India was non-aligned for the first 30, 40 years. We did not get to any military partnership. We had very limited options in terms of investing in the military-industrial complex. So we went into the public sector. Today, after the Cold War is over, India has formed new partnerships, particularly with the US. My concern as an analyst is that I personally am not averse to the private sector. Meaning, that it has been very useful for India. Let me talk about shipbuilding. I'm more familiar with that being from the Navy. In the mid-80s, when Indira Gandhi was Prime Minister, a lot of focus was given to indigenous shipbuilding, Navy particularly. And the lead yard at that time was Mazagon Docks Limited. In Bombay, whether it was the Tatas or the L&T or the Mahindras, there were various companies that also could have been encouraged to join. But they were not, for a number of political reasons. And there is something called the DRDO, the Defense Research and Development, etc., which was protecting its own empire and turf. So consequently, we lost a lot of time, we lost money, we lost investment, and our public sector units have not performed very efficiently. So we have unions, we have productivity which is well below the global median, etc., etc. So when I spoke earlier about what I said as an inadequate higher defense management, this is what I meant. That there is not enough competence and there is not enough resolve. I, as an analyst, security analyst, are more concerned saying that I want the right combat platform. Whether it is a Bofors gun or a fighter aircraft or a submarine or whatever. How you do it is a challenge of governance. And that is where I think the Indian system has been inadequate. So I just want to clarify that I don't think we are now suggesting that it has to be only private or only public. I think each country has to evolve its own model. I mean, France is a good example. They have a large public sector for their nuclear and other industries. So does Israel, so on and so forth. So my focus again is to say that let us get the best equipment for our troops. And if we can do that from within the country, that would be very good. And to his credit, Modi has given this focus. But there is no bench strength. That's my repeated point. Manmohan Singh and Narasimha Rao could do what they did because they had professionals. Monte Ahluwalia, Nirmani, Rakesh Mohan, I'm forgetting the other names. There were a whole host of them, Shankaracharya, who were able to, who would come from the World Bank, who would come from the IMF, and they were able to do all the, what I would call as nuts and bolts work. यहाँ पे है नहीं कोई. There is no Monte. There is no Shankaracharya. And that is why we have people who are, very good at complying with rules. I mean, we have a ridiculous situation where we have spoken about defense offsets for the last 10 years that I can remember. Maybe Khalid and Ashutosh will remember. That has gone through 4 iterations. Kabhi 10% hoga, kabhi 20% hoga, and I speak to some of these foreign people who are interested in coming to India, and they say that we are completely stumped. कि आपके rules बदल जाते हैं. So like that, I think the ability to create the appropriate ecosystem is not yet there in a convincing way. I hope it happens. But that is really, I think, the big question mark. And to respond, is that okay, Dr. Sarita? I think I've adequately given you a response.
Yes, sir. Very adequately. Thank you.
Let me start Dr. Jha and Mr. Das regarding China and where we are. I fear, and I say this with sadness, national security now has become the equivalent of what I call as a simulacrum. Everything is a spectacle. Most of you are familiar with the word simulacrum, which is a make-believe. And in its most intense manner, the manifestation of simulacrum is that the virtual reality becomes even more convincing than actual reality. And I think we are now going through that phase. I mean, I see statements like the other day, Rajnath Singh made a statement about that attack on the Indian ship, that we will find them wherever they are, the depths of the ocean, vagara, vagara, which is not backed up by adequate capability. And that comes back to the point of Mr. Das. Why are the Houthis attacking Indian ships? Is it because of our support to Israel? These are all the geopolitical questions that are. But even if you want to support Israel, I think that is a political choice of the government of the day. How does it impact Indian interests? I mean, that is what we have to see. And we come back to that point about what are India's values? What are India's principles? Why is it that we are unable to speak about Gaza for a country that had a position on West Asia and Gaza, Palestine for decades? Personally, this is my view. You all may not share it. I'm anguished about what is happening in Gaza. It's a very sad reflection, I think, on the modern decade. That the so-called right to protect, if you remember, there was an R2P when there was a lot of turbulence in Africa. Today, now, it is only a right to attack, which has been given to Israel, and I think the United States is culpable here. And we, as a large country, and by the way, China also, barring some pro forma, I would say, statements in the United Nations Security Council and elsewhere, we have not done anything meaningful. And this is for a country whose pedigree goes back to the Korean War. I think Mr. Das made that point. They're in a very difficult situation. The Indian government, led by Nehru, are able to actually convince the others that let us do something. I mean, warfare and bloodshed is not the only answer. I think we've lost something in that, process. And my anxiety is that with China also, today, I mean, 2024, 2 years after Galwan, there is no official paper about what happened. 3 years, 2020 mein hua tha. It's that, there are no borders, so nothing is lost, which is again whitewash. If you read Narwane's excerpts, you'll get an idea about how serious the issue is. So personally, I'm not very convinced that we are dealing with China in the right way. I'm not suggesting war, far from it. But at least you must acknowledge the setback to be able to deal with it. I mean, Chinese, for Americans of Chinese origin and I met them in some conference last year when I went, they were amused and also intrigued. Saying, what is India all about? You guys constantly say that nothing has happened. And here you come to the seminar and make a presentation about how China poses a threat to India, etc., etc. So I'm afraid this virtual reality is going to cost us heavily. This is my view again. You may or may not subscribe to this. Is that okay for the issues raised by Dr. Jha and Mr. Das?
Yes, Commodore, it is quite exactly. You answered our doubts and questions.
Okay, so thank you, sir. And before I go to Sangeeta ma'am, Commodore Bhaskar sir, Mr. Ashok Das raised one more point, which I thought could be addressed. This was regarding India's participation in UN peacekeeping force. I think that was. If I remember correctly, you mentioned about that also, that India used to be part of peacekeeping forces for the conflicts around the world, and why it is not happening now. So, sir, would you like to address that part as well?
Should I let Dr. Das Gupta speak? Uske baad mein isko bhi add it in that.
Okay. So, ma'am, Sangeeta Das Gupta, ma'am, over to you.
A very, very interesting presentation, sir. Thank you very, very much, because for people who are rather naive like me, this opened up a gamut of issues. And that's where, therefore, my questions stem from. So, there's a lot of importance that's given to the military when it comes to the statements that are issued by the government. And yet, as you've pointed out, resources are spent much more on salaries than on capital, what is actually required for the army. So I was actually wondering that why this kind of discrepancy, because for a normal public, it seems that the importance which is given to the military is enormous. So that's the first question. So would you say that, resources, why not therefore the resources to the army when so much of importance seems to be given on these matters? The second question that I had is, therefore, besides the government, who else is a part of taking such decisions on policy matters? So would you also argue that, and it seemed to be the of the argument, that initially you had the government being much more open to these ideas than now. So is there a steady decline, and do you attribute it to the changing political organization, the parties with the party which is now in power? The third question that I had in mind is you talked about the importance of language in understanding security, and you explained it in the context of India. So, is there any other example that you can put forward for us to understand the importance of language and security? How do we kind of link the two? Because you did make this link initially. But thank you once again for an extremely interesting presentation.
Sir, there's one more query. Mr. Gopal Ranjan ji has raised his hand. So would you like him also to put forward his
Shall
question?
I answer these two because Dr. Dasgupta's are fairly,
Okay.
there are three googlies that she has bowled, so I don't know how I will be able to respond to them. And then I'll also respond to the UN peacekeeping wala. Dr. Dasgupta, I think you raised some very important issues. Let me sort of reel backwards. About language, this is actually an area that I'm still studying. And yes, I can give you a tentative answer, which is that I do not have enough to give you a definitive answer. But China, to me, I've been looking at these two, I would say, examples, largely because of their civilizational pedigree. And as I said, one is reasonably familiar with the Indian experience, largely because of the way in which we interpreted our understanding of the Arthashastra and how it was handed down in Sanskrit and Pali and all of that. Much of it comes into even modern discourse. I'm still groping with Chinese because I don't speak Chinese enough to sort of make this, but I'm talking to a few people who are more conversant and experts, and they have. It's still a work in progress. If I have something, I think there is something about there. For instance, this is said anecdotally. The Chinese do not have an adequate phrase for nonviolence. That is what I've heard from my Chinese colleagues, that the concept itself is alien to them. Now, is there a reason why language has shut out such concept? That's my question, doubt as an analyst. And I often am, as I said, in my early years, I was persuaded by Foucault. And the whole, argument or the formulation that there is a clear link between power and discourse and exclusion and inclusion. So as language evolves, this is my conjecture. I don't have a smoking gun. But if you have any colleagues who are working on this, please point me in that direction. But my conjecture is that, there is this correlation between power and discourse, exclusion, inclusion, and that in the Chinese example itself. I take this as given that when Nehru spoke about nonviolence and the Gandhian freedom struggle, apparently, this is anecdotal, retired ambassadors have said this going back to people like A.P. Venkateshwaran, etc., who were in China, that the Chinese were very intrigued. Mao's team at that time wanted to know what is nonviolence, and it doesn't exist for us kind of thing. Now, this is a bit like saying that, can you go to Alaska well before the cell phone and computer age and convince the Eskimo that they should not be eating seals or polar bears, So I think we are all conditioned by our own, and I'm of the view that language has an important role to play. So let me just leave it at that. And the other two issues that you raised about budgets and why is it that we are not getting adequate funding. Now, this is part of a pattern. The NDA 1 and 2, that is Modi 1 and Modi 2, after coming to governance in 2013, 2014, the Parliamentary Research Service has put on these figures that there has been a steady drop, from where we were between 2 and 2.5% of GDP, which was allocated to defense. Now we have come down to something like 1.97. And the reasons advanced are that other sectors, welfare, child welfare, development, Nariga, infrastructure, they need similar kind of thing. Now, as a former military man, it's not my case to say that the government will spend only on defense. This whole question of butter and guns goes on and on. But if you have the kind of challenges that we do, can we do what the Indian government did to the army in 1962, that you sent them to fight the Chinese with Indian troops wearing canvas shoes at heights of 17,000 feet? Where is Khalid Khan? If he's here as a Gadwali, he can tell us something about, how the soldiers still fought. So again, as objectively as I can interpret this, I think these are the stark realities. And the reason, as I said, is that a determination by the government of the day that we can reduce. And a feeling, that I've heard this argument many times in closed door sessions, and now that we are a nuclear weapon power, our territorial integrity is, sacrosanct. And then we know what happened in Kargil. Kargil was a threat to territorial integrity. So was Galwan. So I think that particular belief or formulation is no longer valid. I mean, look at what happened last week. Iran had the audacity to launch a missile strike on Pakistan, which is a nuclear weapon state, ostensibly as a counter-terror attack. So these are some of the, I would say, new challenges that the entire region and the globe has to deal with. And the last question or the observation you made about decision making and deliberation, the short answer is yes. The quality of deliberations and decision making related to defense has become very cloistered and very opaque. Whereas these were issues that were discussed in parliament and committees at one time. And, people, experts. So this is I as an expert, well after I retired, used to be called to parliamentary committees to, offer my thoughts. I was not alone. There were many of my peer group who would share their thoughts. Government used to set up committees, and even if committees' reports were not implemented, at least they did some homework. Tandoori's report is one example. That's not happening anymore. So it's a bit like saying that now, if the numbers are not favorable, don't carry out surveys. So that is an extrapolation to what is happening. And let me now, is that okay, Dr. Dasgupta?
Yes, of course. Can I just add one little thing? What do you think of this whole concept of Akhand Bharat?
What do I think of?
This whole concept of Akhand Bharat, which is now being projected. So how do you respond
I think
to
that will be the whole session. I don't want to do injustice and make a flippant sort of response. But we are now at 2025, and I imagine Ashutosh will want to make some concluding remarks. So if time permits, we can, as I said, have a longer chat, but it is fraught with many eggshells. That is my short response, conceptually. Let me turn to the
incorrect question. Sorry for.
क्या बोल रहे हैं?
Sorry, sir. I said it was a politically incorrect question at this juncture. We can have a session on this, but definitely.
Surely as a group, we can raise anything and, see how much we can address. No, I don't think it's politically incorrect. We can have a longer chat. But to get back to what's the question that Group Captain Kumar had, Ashutosh had said on UN peacekeeping. Yes, I think at one time India had a very high credibility. And to my mind, Korea was not technically a UN peacekeeping mission. It was a tripartite, and it had been done at the initiative of India and Yugoslavia and one more country, I forget the third one. And Nehru played a very major part at that time in ensuring that the armistice was respected by both sides. But I thought India's high point in UN peacekeeping was in Congo. If you all remember the time in the 60s, we had Patrick Lumumba and what happened, the genocide in Congo, what the Belgians had done, etc. I think India played whenever I've gone to Africa, older Africans have spoken with great regard for the Indian role at that time. And more recently, at the time of the end of the Cold War, I think what General Satish Nambiar did in Yugoslavia as the force commander of the UN peacekeeping force is also remembered very, I would say, with high esteem and regard. But after that, I think India has not been as active because we are not a permanent member of the UN Security Council. And UN peacekeeping has also become fragmented. And there are different players, and now Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nepal, they have all become very active in there, wanting to be there. And I think I've again internally argued this and written on this papers for consideration that we have to become the equivalent of a Germany and a Japan. Germany and Japan are given a place on the high table when it comes to, say, for instance, economic issues, or even in relation to the Iran situation. Germany was invited, 5+1. India has, but I don't know whether we have enough bandwidth to do it when we have all these other so-called priorities that are consuming the capacity and the oxygen of the higher defense management team and the entire political, I would frame it. So we're exactly 2 minutes from 2030, Ashutosh. So back to you.
Sir, Mr. Gopal Ranjan, he had raised his hand some time back, so I'll request it. Probably the last question here.
Yeah. Thanks, Ashutosh ji. Thank you for this brilliant session, Commodore. My question is very specific to a recent decision that Indian Defence Forces took. There is the Agnipath scheme. So how do you see that with respect to the security question that we discussed today? So do you see any negative fallouts, or is it really because there are so many controversies around this particular scheme? So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on this particular scheme.
This is a work in progress, and I always tell myself that as a retired officer, we should step back and not assume that we know what is happening within the system. The serving people, for their own reason, have taken a decision. And as I said, it's a work in progress. We have to see how it would play out. But we need at least a decade plus before we get some sense about is this going to improve or enhance our combat efficiency, which is the which is the ultimate metric. It doesn't matter, as I said, that old saying of dung, it doesn't matter what color the cat is when it catches the mice. So like that, you can have any scheme, but what does it do for the overall combat efficiency and sustaining the Indian military? Now, the reason advanced is budgetary, that the pension bill is going up, so we'll do this. But I have had my reservations. I expressed them, when the scheme was announced. And if you look at Narwane's book, the excerpts, the way in which this decision was taken is also raising a lot of doubts. And until, some more time elapses, we don't know. But already I see one negative impact, which I've, again, drawn attention to. I've written about it. Nepal is not comfortable with the Agnipath Agniveer scheme because in the erstwhile pattern, all the Gorkha citizens of Nepal who joined the Indian Army were getting a pension. And that was an enormous, I would say, incentive and also in India's security interest to have really crack troops. The Gorkhas are right on top. Where is the infantryman here, Gadwal rifles? I think there may be some sectarian competition here. If I were to say the Gorkhas are a notch higher than the Gadwalis. But all I'm saying is that now we had, I forget how many, I think we had 12 to 13 Gorkha battalions. And now, not a single new Gorkha is being recruited because of Agnipath. And the Nepal government has politically said that we are not able to allow our citizens to come. So your Gorkha Paltans now are depleted. So now we are trying to get people from Indian Gorkhas. And off the record, what I've heard anecdotally is that there is a differential between the competence of the people we are recruiting from within India and people who come from the traditional hill districts of Nepal, who, based on their tribal, ethnicity and historically for the last 150 to 100 years have joined the Indian Army. So I see that as I said, a cause for some concern. But I differ. I'm only an analyst. I think the job of an analyst is to actually look at facts and, like a pathologist, then arrive at some report. So now I think we should give the serving people, the chiefs and their principal staff officers, I would say, space to carry this experiment forward and see what kind of impact it has.
Sure. Thanks, Commodore.
Ashutosh, if I'm just allowed to, allowed to come in. Basically, yes. When Commodore Bhaskar talked about 6 o'clock, I presumed he must have had some other engagements, and of course, notwithstanding his physical situation. But what I request, since we have continued the sessions in the past till 9:30 or so, not that I'm saying we should continue till 9:30. If Commodore Bhaskar is not too uncomfortable with his situation, we can take some questions. But it's all, the decision is yours and Bhaskar's.
Should we arrive at the golden mean? पहले एक सवाल है क्या आशुतोष? कोई other people?
I don't see any hands raised. But the only person I thought could have raised his hand is Arun Roy, sir, and he already did that. he took this invitation, I should say.
Sunil,
So
please go ahead,
yeah,
Arun.
Uh, First of all, a trivial statement. Hexagon, as all the people who are in science know, that it is the most stable structure after circle. Most stable. So I was not surprised Commodore Bhaskar giving us two hexagonal situation. I mean, sorry, models. Although he did add a word vulnerable, but there were two. So this is a triviality. Now, since you linked during the end of your session, and very rightly so, that the economic situation of a country inside is very much a prime factor in defining security. Of course, the social conditions. During the COVID, it was highly hyped that out of 1,000 companies which would be leaving China, and they will all come to India, I have found most of them going to Vietnam or even Bangladesh. Not more than 5 came to India. I do not want to prolong the question. In your assessment, what could have been the reason? And does it have any impact, or does it have any additional parameters to what you have already spoken about, social security linked with the economy and internal situation?
Shall I respond, Ashutosh?
yes, sir. All yours.
Sorry, I missed out the first part, Arun. जो आप कह रहे थे, what is this, observation of the hexagon? Did I miss something? आप कुछ कह रहे थे?
No, that was a comment, sir. That was a comment. He said that
No.
hexagon is a stable structure.
Stable structure. Okay, got it. But we should have this chat, I think, on a separate kind of offline. That when you have, who are the mathematicians and the IT people here, when you have two hexagons with 6 determinants, and they're also dynamic, what are the permutations, combinations? If somebody can walk me through that, that will be useful. But that's for another day. But the point about Vietnam, my again reading is that I've also been looking at this. I think there was a lot of expectation that India would be the preferred destination. But I'm not, as I said, this is not my area of competence. But as an outsider, as someone who's just keeping up with current developments and so on, I am a great, student of strategic culture. And I think Vietnam exudes a very distinctive strategic culture. And that, I think, is their USP, which is playing out in the corporate world. Meaning, if you look at Vietnam, from the time it sort of emerged out of its own colonial experience, which is very tragic, it's the only country that has been able to stand up with very limited resources to 3 of the permanent members of the Security. Sorry. Beg your pardon. 3 of the permanent members of the Security Council in a very difficult time domestically. One was France, the second was the United States, and the third was China. And I think after the unification, they have evolved a national kind of identity that they are going to prevail and bring up the socio-economic indicators of their people under the communist kind of governance model, etc., and have exuded both resolve and credibility to be able to provide that alternative to China. I don't think we have been able to do that. And that is my short response. But I'm sure that there are some of you who are more familiar with the corporate world, and I can only look at the geopolitics. And I think, given the Vietnam-China kind of equation, there is perhaps also a quiet nudge that let Vietnam be the beneficiary along with Taiwan to be able to accommodate, whatever is emerging from China. But this again is still, I think, a work in progress, because China itself is going through some internal economic challenges. And in the event Donald Trump becomes president next year after this election, I think we'll see a complete churn at many levels, and we'll have to see how that plays out. But I'll leave it at there for now.
Yeah, just one more thing. You had talked about Ram Mandir. I'm still intrigued about why did you mention that? Because of course I have my own assessments and my own thoughts about the importance of social fabric being very, very strong for any country to stand up to any kind of a challenge. But this Ram Mandir, since you mentioned it, would you slightly elaborate on that?
No, the only observation I have is that, first of all, I think we are aware that the whole Ram Mandir issue has become both, I would say, emotive, and there is also a lot of polarization. I have seen commentary and discussions also in fairly small groups, family, friends, and elsewhere, that if you are not endorsing and you're not enthused by the Rama, then you're anti-Hindu. Then you're supporting the Muslim. I don't think of what I would call as crude binaries. My concern is more as a security analyst that, as I said, the kind of triumphalism that we are seeing in some constituencies, if that is played out in a way that is detrimental to fraternity, that's my operative word, and that plays out, I think, over the next year in different pockets, that is going to damage India's, I would say, internal security. And we could have a repeat of what is happening in Manipur. That's my concern. Harun?
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. Just one or two lines, Commodore, I had written to you also. It was Ashok Das who had proposed in the group that maybe he is so candid and outspoken. Could we have no recording of his session? And I salute you for the fact that you had absolutely no hesitation in saying that whatever you want to say can go on the record. Number one. Number two, again, in the group we did talk about a lot about South China, the Vietnam, absence of India there in Manipur. But you in a very, very brief way did discuss all that. So once again, salute to you. And last but not the least, my friends now would realize why I talked about Commodore Bhaskar, not about his professional and other achievements and his vast amount of knowledge and wisdom. This man, despite all that, spent time as a 20-year-old boy, his research work on neural models. So from my side, it is thank you, sir. Ashutosh, please take over. Sorry, one more thing. I wished we had another session with him. Like most of the brilliant speakers that we have had, they did find some time to take a second session for us. So Commodore Bhaskar, it will be a personal request. I'll be speaking from the behalf of everybody. If you could still find time, maybe a month later, maybe a couple of later, whenever you are free, sir, it will be an honor to have you once again with us, sir. Ashutosh?
Okay, so I thought Commodore Bhaskar is responding, but sir, if you permit, Commodore Bhaskar, sir, Mr. Deepankar has raised his hand. I don't know if he has some query or comment, but we can briefly, sir, can you very quickly, Mr. Deepankar, can you unmute yourself and say?
Yeah, I just had a small question. I'm actually a little confused about the role of CDS. What does the CDS do?
I think that will need another session, sir. Anyway,
no, but the brief
sir,
response, now that you have raised it, Mr. Mukhopadhyay, see, the CDS, when it was instituted, when General Rawat was appointed as the first CDS, the mandate was to, in a way, implement jointness and then move towards theater commands. I mean, that was the brief that was given to the post of the CDS. But unfortunately, for a variety of internal reasons and what I call as the inadequacies of higher defense management, number one, General Rawat died in that tragic helicopter crash. And then there was a big gap before the next man could be appointed. And that appointment, frankly, raised a lot of eyebrows because it was a retired three-star, and if you're in the armed forces, you know the implications of that. And so far, we have not been able to evolve, I think, jointness because there is still some inter-service reservations, particularly the Air Force. And I think Ashutosh can add to that about the use of air power. Do we have enough assets? Personally, I think we don't have enough assets to be able to distribute it to the theaters. But these are all, I said, issues that have to be still addressed. But the idea of the CDS was to enable jointness. Mr. Mukhopadhyay?
Oh, thank you so much. And you spoke so much like a professor. Thank you so much.
Okay. Colonel Khan, I can see him raising a hand. Sorry, Uday Bhaskar, sir. There are more people raising queries or questions. So, Khan sir, over to you.
Sir, just wanted to share my experience about the ignorance amongst the masses, especially the educated masses also. I have a very close friend who recently retired from the bureaucracy from a very high level. When she asked me, what do you do in army when there is no war?
Oh my God.
And secondly, she said that in the bureaucratic parlance, we feel that the expenditure on defense is a non-productive expenditure. That's why we try to curtail it. This mere ignorance about the thing. Just wanted to share this fact.
No, there are many such examples. Maybe later on when we meet offline, I can share some what I would call as both amusing and alarming experiences in South Block. But that's for another time.
Well said, Colonel Khan, sir. Well said. So any more points, questions? Last call, I would say.
Sure. Then let me thank all of you. Oh yeah, going. Gotcha. Dr. Sarita.
Dr. Sarita.
I just have a comment. That same is what Dr. Colonel Khan said. In terms of pension, someone raised also that they get pension and that large chunk goes in pension. Now, I have two family members. My brother, who's colonel, worked in army for 30 years, just retired 1 or 2 years ago, and my brother-in-law, who was in bank and retired. Both joined at the same time and both have a government job. But in terms of pension, my brother gets much less pension than him. So it's not even the civilian get more pension than the military personnel. And as ignorance, as Dr. Colonel Khan said, yeah, civilians are very ignorant what military personnel have to go. It is a brave thing, even a courageous thing to think to join military. You have to be a very different kind of person to go and say that, okay, I can be killed to saving someone. So yes, I think civilians do not know what they go through and what kind of training they have to go through and what kind of mental torture they have to go through. Not only that, they don't get even enough support in terms of what my brother goes through, the nightmares every night. So Indian government is not even providing enough support to veterans who have left the military. So civilians who have courage, who have this audacity to say that what you do and it's a waste of money, they really need to be shown like big mirror. That it is the civilians who are many times we waste money on.
Now that Dr. Sarita made this observation.
Thank you for services. Yeah, thank you for your services, all of you.
Thank you. I just want to respond and add to what Dr. Sarita has just said. There's a lot of talk about this pension bill becoming too large, unsustainable, etc. Since you have spoken about your brother and your brother-in-law, one a Fauji and the other a banker, and the differential being in favor of the banker, the civilian retired person. I just want you to know that anecdotally, we have a situation where in the government of India, there are different levels of entry and retirement. At top of the pack, you have the IAS officers, and which is the class 1 central services, which has the foreign service and the IAS, the IPS, etc. And then as you go down the ladder, in our time, there used to be something called the class 4, which largely used to be the equivalent of peons and people who were in the government, drivers and safai karamcharis, etc. in that particular bracket. And I remember I had the equivalent of a peon when I used to work in South Block. And he had joined the government of India in central government, Ministry of Defense, etc., etc. He was from Haryana. And he got in because of some, recommendation and Bhaibandi, etc. in those days, I think in the 60s. And he retired well into the 90s, etc. And he was able to work till the age of 58. And today, with all the pay commissions, he gets a pension. His own brother joined the Fauj and retired as a Havaldar after doing the equivalent of 18 years of service, or 20, whatever, 18, 20. He gets a pension, which when I last met them informally in some social event, he said it's a quarter. So can you see the differential? That here is a man who leaves at the age of roughly 35 from the Fauj as a Havaldar. His counterpart in the civilian side at the equivalent of a Daftari peon, whatever, bats for another 23 years and gets the full benefit of being in government. And when he retires, like the banker, and I'm not saying cut that, far from it. Everybody has to be looked after when they retire. But the unfairness of the system and then making out that they are a drain. That is what I think hurts what I would call as the izzat or the forge. That's my limited point for discussion. So on that note, thank you all of you for this patient hearing. And Ashutosh, sorry, over to you.
Thank you so much, sir. I don't have any. In fact, it will not be appropriate to conclude this talk, because as a student of military studies, as I said earlier, we have grown up hearing about you, reading your articles and things like that, and here I have the privilege of listening to you live. So thank you so much, sir. And before we close the session, I would like to specially thank you and mention here about a question that you answered, sir, the way you handled it. This was about Agnipath, which is the most controversial of the subjects which anybody could handle or answer. And very well said, sir. It is work in progress. The I don't know, whatever be the thought behind it, it is an optimization problem, so to say. As Dr. Sangeeta had mentioned, that why the bill on capital, why the budgetary provision for capital expenditure is so low, and pays and pension, it takes major chunk of it. Probably government was trying to handle it this way, but as Commodore Bhaskar has said, only time will tell whether it is a right call or not, and it is still a work in progress. So thank you so much, sir. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Good day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commodore.
Thank you.
And I mean, despite your physical condition, you did not allow it for even a second, or barring the few interruptions. Hats off to you once again, even for that, sir.
Thank you.
That's about the soldier, sir.
Thank you.
Correct.
Okay. Bye bye, everyone. Good night.
Bye bye.
Bye, sir. Bye, sir.
Bye.